People aren't just moving anymore. They're leaving. Not because of weather, not because of luck, because the math stopped working state by state, deal by deal, promise by promise. These are the 10 states where that calculation broke. And what the people walking away are trying to tell us. Oregon. Oregon didn't collapse from indifference. It collapsed from ambition. Portland spent a decade as the model American city. Walkable, culturally rich, a city that took its problems seriously enough to try things no one else had tried. Then the trying stopped working. Downtown retail vacancy climbed past 25%. The homelessness crisis, approached with decriminalization and services rather than enforcement, outgrew the services. Oregon tried to solve the problem in a new way. It didn't scale. More than 30,000 people left in 2022 alone. Not a random cross-section. Young families, small business owners, the upwardly mobile working class that every city needs to survive. Outside Portland, the picture is different. Bend is one of the fastest growing mid-sized cities in the West. The state's natural economy is very much alive. But what Oregon is losing is concentrated exactly where it can least afford to lose it. The state has the intelligence to course correct. What it's still building is the will. Pennsylvania. There is a specific melancholy that belongs to states that were once essential. Pennsylvania was not just part of the American founding, it was the founding. Philadelphia, Independence Hall. And then Pittsburgh, the steel, the railroads, the factories that turned American ambition into physical infrastructure. That era ended slowly. The mills closed across generations. The coal towns compressed. Pennsylvania's population grew by less than 2% over the last decade, among the slowest in the country. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh tell brighter stories. Fishtown and Graduate Hospital in Philly. Pittsburgh rebuilt around robotics and healthcare after steel. Both cities have earned real recognition. But they are two bright anchors connected by 300 miles of economic contraction. Pennsylvania's political geography, suspended between its two great urban centers and a politically opposite interior, has made the decisive investment required to close that gap nearly impossible to assemble. It's not that lawmakers don't see the problem. It's that the coalition required to solve it hasn't found its majority. The state that helped build America is watching the construction happen somewhere else. Illinois. There's a number that defines Illinois more honestly than any skyline. $211 billion. That is the state's unfunded pension liability. The gap between what Illinois promised its public workers, teachers, firefighters, state employees, and what it actually set aside to pay them. Here's the trap. A 1970 constitutional provision makes those pension benefits legally untouchable. They cannot be reduced, they cannot be restructured. Every attempt to address it under governors of both parties has been struck down by the state Supreme Court. So the number grows, and every year a larger share of the state budget flows to pension obligations instead of roads, schools, or anything that might attract new residents. Illinois has lost population every single year for nearly a decade. Chicago shed more than 50,000 residents between 2020 and 2023. Property taxes rank among the highest in the Midwest, not because services are exceptional, but because the pension math demands it. International immigration and a real tech sector partially offset the losses. Chicago still attracts, but no amount of inbound talent compensates for structural fiscal insolvency. Illinois isn't failing because of any single decision. It's failing because it made promises it couldn't keep, and the Constitution won't let it fix the math. New York. New York doesn't suffer from a lack of desire. People still want to be here, desperately, romantically. The skyline still stops people cold. What New York suffers from is the growing gap between wanting to be here and being able to afford to be here. Between 2020 and 2023, New York State recorded a net domestic outmigration of over 800,000 people. That is not a neighborhood. That is a mid-sized American city evacuated. Median rent for a one-bedroom in Manhattan crossed $4,000. Brooklyn, once the affordable alternative, regularly exceeds $3,000. But the deeper wound isn't the rent numbers. It's who is leaving, not just the economically fragile. New York is pricing out its teachers, its nurses, its musicians, and artists, and small restaurant owners, the exact people who built the culture that made the city worth moving to. International immigration still flows in at a scale few cities can match. High-income earners in finance and tech are largely staying, but the city is becoming more global and less economically diverse at the same time. Land use regulations dating to the 1960s restrict density in ways that prevent construction from meeting demand. The politics of zoning in New York have always been explosive. The math of supply and demand is not. The city's desirability is dismantling its diversity, and its diversity was always its greatest product. Hawaii. There's a phrase you hear in Hawaii. Lucky you live Hawaii. Said with warmth, said with pride, and increasingly said with the exhaustion of someone who loves a place they can no longer afford to stay in. The median home price crossed $800,000. The cost of living ranks among the highest in the nation, and unlike California or New York, there is no adjacent affordable state to retreat to. The ocean is not a commutable distance. Between 2020 and 2023, Hawaii lost over 30,000 residents to net out migration. In a state of 1.4 million, that is a community, not a statistic. And it is a specific community, not the vacation homeowners who fly in 4 times a year, not the remote workers who relocated during the pandemic and can absorb the premium. It is the people who were born here, who cooked the food, taught the children, fixed the roads, and kept the culture alive. The pandemic brought wealthy mainland transplants who permanently raised the price floor. Short-term rental platforms absorbed thousands of units that might have housed local families. And a federal shipping law, the Jones Act, artificially inflates the cost of nearly everything that arrives on the islands. Hawaii has never fully answered the question it most needs to answer. Who is paradise for? Mississippi. Mississippi is always last. Median household income near $42,000, roughly 2/3 of the national average. Infant mortality at 9.1 deaths per 1,000 live births, the highest in the nation, double Massachusetts. Nearly 17% of residents below the poverty line. Life expectancy trailing the healthiest states by more than 5 years. Those are not just numbers. They are the accumulated result of what happens when a state is chronically underinvested, not for years, but for generations. Net out migration has been essentially continuous for decades. Mississippi has been exporting its most ambitious residents, disproportionately young, educated, and black, to Atlanta, Houston, Nashville, anywhere the gap is smaller. And yet Mississippi is not a blank slate. The Delta Blues were born here. The food traditions that became American food and then global food were shaped in Mississippi kitchens. The cultural depth of this state is extraordinary and chronically underacknowledged. But culture does not fix a water system. Jackson, the state capital, went weeks without reliable running water. In America, in the 21st century, the Gulf Coast has attracted aerospace manufacturing and automotive suppliers. Real investments, just not large enough or distributed broadly enough to alter a trajectory built over generations. Mississippi is not a story of failure of character. It is a story of what happens when neglect compounds long enough that leaving feels like the only rational response. West Virginia. West Virginia was made a promise. A specific generational one. Dig the coal, fuel the nation's furnaces, power the cities that could not power themselves. And in return, union wages, stability, a working-class life built on extraction. The nation did not keep that promise. West Virginia is the only state in the continental United States with fewer people today than it had in 1950. The population has fallen below 1.78 million. 3 generations of departure, compounding annually. The median age, 43.5, is among the highest in the country. Schools have closed not because education is failing, but because there are fewer children to fill them. Then the opioid crisis arrived, precisely as the coal economy collapsed. West Virginia's overdose death rate led the nation for years, more than 80 per 100,000 at its peak. That number, in human terms, means entire communities reshaped by grief. The New River Gorge National Park has driven real tourism growth. A small wave of remote workers drawn by cheap land and extraordinary terrain has arrived. These are genuine bright notes. But federal investment, however meaningful, cannot reverse 75 years of compounding departure in a legislative session. West Virginia is not a story of people giving up. It is a story of a promise broken at industrial scale and a people still living in the wreckage. Louisiana. Louisiana is not just losing people. Louisiana is losing ground, literally. Every 100 minutes, Louisiana loses another football field of coastal land to the Gulf of Mexico. The land sinks, erodes, and disappears, compressed by oil and gas extraction, pushed back by rising seas. cut apart by decades of canal dredging that disrupted the sediment flow that once rebuilt what the Gulf consumed. Entire communities that existed for 2 centuries are gone from the map, not metaphorically, cartographically. Inland, the loss is compound. New Orleans is smaller now than it was before Katrina 20 years later. The poverty rate stands at 18.6%, second in the nation. And the industrial corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, known informally as Cancer Alley, records cancer risk levels among the highest in the country. The oil and gas industry that built Louisiana's political economy for a century is also the industry most responsible for its coastline disappearing. Litigation has moved through the courts for years with limited results. Coastal restoration is underway, but scientists who study the Delta are nearly unanimous. Restoration cannot keep pace with loss. New Orleans' tourism economy has recovered. Baton Rouge's petrochemical sector remains. These are real anchors. But no economy survives if the land beneath it keeps leaving. Louisiana is not failing because its people lack fight. It is failing because the ground is losing the same fight. California was supposed to be the answer. For 150 years, that was the operating premise. When the frontier closed, California became the new frontier. When the Dust Bowl hit, California became the refuge. When the tech economy needed a home, California provided the address. Then the mythology met the math. Between 2020 and 2023, California recorded a net domestic outmigration of over 500,000 people. Median home price in Los Angeles, $900,000. San Francisco, $1.2 million. These are not luxury markets. These are entry-level numbers for anyone hoping to own property in the state that once promised ownership to anyone willing to work. Wildfire seasons that no longer feel seasonal. Rolling blackouts in the most technologically sophisticated economy in the world. Water infrastructure designed for a 20th century climate that no longer exists. And yet, California's GDP remains the 5th largest in the world if counted as a nation. International immigration flows in at rates that partially offset domestic departure. The tech sector is not leaving. What California is losing is not its economy. It is its accessibility. The California that was promised, the affordable dream, the working class paradise, the place where hard work could still become a down payment, that California is gone. It did not collapse. It just became a place where fewer and fewer people qualify to stay. The question is not whether California will survive. It will. The question is, who is it still for? New Jersey. Picture this. You earn $95,000 a year. In most of America, that's comfortable. In New Jersey, it barely holds. State income tax bites hard. Top brackets approaching 11%, among the highest in the country. Property taxes average $9,400 annually, the highest in the nation, not a misprint. And in return, you commute into a city you can't afford to live in, past tolls you've paid 10,000 times, through infrastructure that moves at the pace of frustration. New Jersey sold itself as the compromise, Manhattan access, suburban space, a city without city prices. For decades, the pitch worked. Then the fine print caught up. Net outmigration has exceeded 60,000 people a year. And it's not random, it's the middle class, small business owners, retirees who did the math and lost. Yes, wealthy remote workers and Manhattan transplants are still arriving, but they raise the price floor without fixing the underlying problem. The state is gaining the rich and losing everyone else. New Jersey didn't fail its residents dramatically. It just quietly stopped making sense for them. And they left.